Aaliyah stood in the kitchen, the quiet hum of the house surrounding her as the soft light of the morning crept through the windows. The sunlight seemed to hold the entire room in a gentle embrace, casting soft shadows across the countertops, where her hands worked automatically, preparing breakfast for the two children she cared for, Splendor and Emmanuel. Every movement was routine, almost mechanical. It was the kind of peaceful morning one might expect in a home filled with laughter and warmth, yet there was something off, something different. Aaliyah had been working as a nanny for the Jacob family for over a year. Brianna, the mother of the children, was a successful woman, constantly busy with her work as a corporate executive. Zach, her husband, was a devoted father, but there was a distance that had slowly begun to form between them over the years. Brianna was frequently away for business trips, and Zach often found himself home alone with Aaliyah and the kids. The time spent together should have been innocent, merely a functional routine where Aaliyah helped with chores, prepared meals, and cared for the children. But this morning, as the smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm pancakes filled the air, Aaliyah couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between her and Zach. It started with something small, insignificant, really. A simple touch as Zach walked by her in the hallway. A fleeting moment. His hand brushed against hers, a simple gesture, but it had lingered for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. It wasn't the first time. They had crossed paths hundreds of times before, but this time, that brief, accidental contact sent an electric current through her veins. She hadn't expected it. She hadn't asked for it. But now, she couldn't ignore it. Aaliyah tried to shake the sensation, convincing herself that it was just a fleeting moment, a casual, meaningless touch. She busied herself with making breakfast, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened every time she thought about it. But then, when she turned toward the counter, she saw him. Zach stood in the doorway, watching her, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He hadn't said anything, but there was something in his gaze, a depth, a weight. It was as if he could see right through her, into the parts of her that no one else had ever noticed. And in that instant, something between them shifted. Their eyes locked. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. She felt her heart race. The connection was immediate, undeniable. She had never looked at Zach like this before. Sure, she had always admired him as a good father, someone who adored his children, but this was something else. This was a knowing. A shared understanding, an unspoken agreement that neither of them could deny. They stood there, in the soft morning light, as if the world had momentarily ceased to exist. In that brief moment, time seemed to stretch. It felt as if the entire world was holding its breath. She quickly averted her gaze, focusing on the eggs she was cooking. Her hands trembled ever so slightly, betraying the calm exterior she was desperately trying to maintain. No. This wasn't happening. This can't be happening. But when she dared to glance up again, their eyes met once more. This time, Zach didn't look away. Instead, his lips curved into a small, knowing smile. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it held so much meaning. It wasn't just a friendly smile, it was as if he understood what she was feeling, as if he too was aware of the shift that had taken place between them. Aaliyah's breath caught in her chest. Her heart pounded in her ears. This isn't right. He's married. He has a family. What are we doing? She thought, desperately trying to push the thoughts away. But even as she tried to suppress her feelings, something else surged within her, something stronger than logic, stronger than reason. It was only supposed to be one touch, she whispered softly to herself, her voice barely audible, the words more a confession than a thought. One moment, but it felt like an avalanche. The weight of those words hit her like a wave. She couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. This wasn't just a simple touch. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. The attraction was undeniable, and she could feel it pulsing between them, thick and heavy in the air, waiting to consume them both. Aaliyah quickly looked down, her face flushed with guilt and confusion. She couldn't explain what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain: this was a line she could never uncross. There was no turning back now. She had already allowed herself to feel too much, to see something that had always been hidden in the shadows. But even as she battled the rising tide of shame and fear, she couldn't stop herself from wanting more. Was this wrong? Should I feel guilty? She had spent years keeping her heart in check, focused solely on the children, on being the devoted nanny she promised to be. But now, everything felt uncertain. "Do you need any help with breakfast?" Zach's voice broke through her thoughts, and Aaliyah looked up to find him standing just a few feet away, his expression softening. His voice, though casual, carried an undercurrent of something unspoken, something that echoed her own thoughts. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice more brittle than she intended. She forced a smile, hoping he couldn't see the turmoil swirling inside her. Zach didn't push further. He simply nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned to leave. But before he could fully turn away, Aaliyah heard him say, almost under his breath, "It's okay, Aaliyah. I understand." The words hung in the air, suspended in the silence of the kitchen, filling the space between them. It was as if Zach had read her mind, as if he knew exactly what she was feeling. But how could he? She wondered. How could he know anything about what was going on inside me? Her hands trembled as she finished preparing breakfast, the rhythmic motion of stirring eggs the only thing keeping her grounded. But her thoughts were no longer on the food. They were on him, on that smile, that knowing look. On the way he made her feel seen in a way she had never felt before. The rest of the morning passed in a blur, each movement mechanical, as if her body was operating on autopilot. She couldn't concentrate. Every time she looked at Zach, a knot tightened in her stomach. She tried to focus on the children, on her responsibilities, but the tension between her and Zach was undeniable. The invisible thread that connected them seemed to pull her closer to him with every passing minute. And then, when it was time for her to leave, to head out the door, the pull was almost too much to bear. Aaliyah tried to act normal, but the thoughts, the feelings, everything was swirling inside her, uncontrollable, overwhelming. As she walked toward the door, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder at Zach. He was still in the kitchen, standing by the counter, watching her go. Their eyes met again, and once more, there was that look, the one that made her heart race, the one that made her feel things she shouldn't feel. And in that moment, Aaliyah realized something terrifying: this wasn't just an attraction. It wasn't just a passing fancy. This was something that had the potential to destroy everything. But as she left the house, her pulse still racing, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. She was already caught in a web she had no idea how to escape. What happens next? She thought, the questions swirling in her mind. Where do we go from here? Days passed, each one blurring into the next, yet the growing tension between Aaliyah and Zach only seemed to intensify. The once simple, mundane moments now held a weight she couldn't escape: each touch, each look, each exchange. Aaliyah had convinced herself that the spark she felt for Zach was nothing more than a passing fancy, something that could easily be ignored. But every time their paths crossed, the attraction between them became harder to deny. It started as an innocent, fleeting feeling. A brush of their hands while passing the laundry basket, a shared smile over a child's mischievous antics, a casual conversation about nothing in particular. But each of those moments carried a subtle undercurrent that Aaliyah couldn't ignore. She had always prided herself on being strong, on controlling her emotions. Yet, every time she saw him, something inside her shifted. There was a pull she couldn't quite explain, something magnetic, something dangerous. It was as though an invisible force was drawing them together, and every time they exchanged even the most mundane words, her resolve weakened. I told myself I could resist, but with every touch, I felt myself falling deeper, Aaliyah thought, shaking her head in disbelief as she washed the dishes late one night. She had told herself that she was strong enough to fight this, but it was clear now that her willpower was no match for the growing force between her and Zach. What is this? Why is this happening? She wondered, gripping the edge of the sink as if the physical act of holding onto something solid could anchor her. Zach, for his part, seemed almost oblivious to the storm brewing inside Aaliyah. He continued to be his usual, charming self, a good father and husband at least, outwardly. He never seemed to notice the longing that flickered in Aaliyah's eyes, nor did he seem to be aware of the emotions that churned within her. But there was something more. Something that made Aaliyah wonder whether he was aware of the undercurrent between them, even if he didn't acknowledge it aloud. His actions seemed to speak louder than his words, and every time they were alone, the space between them felt electric. And then came that evening, one she would never forget. The children had already gone to bed, their little bodies curled up under the soft blankets, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Aaliyah was in the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of their late dinner, when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around at first, thinking it was just another routine moment. Zach often lingered in the kitchen after dinner, quietly finishing his own tasks, but always in a way that felt familiar and comfortable. Yet tonight, there was something different. She could feel him there, standing close to her, so close that she could almost feel the heat of his body behind her. When he spoke, his voice was low, barely above a whisper, but there was a heaviness to it, a weight that Aaliyah hadn't heard before. Aaliyah. Zach's voice was thick with emotion. She froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. I don't love Brianna the way I love you. The words struck Aaliyah like a physical blow, the room spinning for a moment as the shock of his confession reverberated through her mind. She felt her breath catch in her throat, her stomach twisting with a mix of disbelief and dread. She had heard those words, or something close to them, in countless movies or novels, but to hear them spoken by Zach, the man who had been a steady presence in her life for the past year, was something entirely different. This is wrong, she thought immediately. It was the first thought that pierced through the haze of emotions she was now feeling. It was the thought that she clung to, as if it were a lifeline. This is a mistake. He's married. He has a family. This can't happen. But even as she repeated the mantra in her mind, something else surged within her. Something stronger. It was a pull, an undeniable force that had been slowly building since that first brush of hands. Aaliyah tried to fight it, to ignore it, but it was impossible. The connection between them was undeniable, and now Zach had named it aloud. He had given voice to the unspoken bond that had been growing between them. But how can I feel this way, she wondered. How can I feel anything but guilt? He's married. He has a wife who loves him. This isn't just a fleeting attraction, this is something deeper. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. She could hear her own pulse in her ears, the adrenaline rushing through her veins as she tried to steady her breath. She had to make him take it back. She had to stop this, stop it before it went any further. But when she turned to face him, the look in his eyes stopped her. There was something raw, something vulnerable in his gaze that made her heart ache. This wasn't just a casual comment. This wasn't just some fleeting moment of weakness. This was something real, something that had been building for longer than she realized. Zach wasn't just confessing his feelings to her, he was opening up a part of himself that she hadn't seen before, a part that made him seem less like the distant husband and more like the man who had slowly become an irreplaceable part of her life. And the worst part? Aaliyah couldn't deny that she felt the same way. She didn't want to feel this way. She didn't want to be the woman who betrayed another woman's trust. She didn't want to be the one who broke apart a family. But she couldn't stop the pull, couldn't stop the rising tide of desire that surged within her every time she looked at him. How can I stop this, she thought, her mind reeling. How can I walk away from this connection that feels so inevitable? Zach took a small step closer, his presence so close now that Aaliyah could feel the warmth of his body radiating toward her. It was a quiet, simple movement, but it spoke volumes. There was no going back now. They were already standing on the edge of something dangerous, and neither of them knew how to pull back from the brink. Aaliyah, I don't want to lie to myself anymore, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I've been fighting this pull between us, for months. But every time I'm near you, it's like I can't breathe unless I'm close to you. She didn't know how to respond. The words hung in the air between them, a fragile thread connecting them both. There were so many things Aaliyah wanted to say. She wanted to tell him that it was wrong, that they could never let this go any further. But all she could do was stand there, her heart racing, her mind in turmoil, as the space between them seemed to shrink with every passing second. And then, without thinking, she found herself moving closer to him. She didn't know why. She didn't know what had driven her to this point. But as their gazes locked once more, the air between them crackled with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Zach, she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of everything that was left unsaid. In that moment, everything else fell away. The guilt, the fear, the reason, it all seemed insignificant in the face of the overwhelming desire that surged between them. And just like that, the connection they had both been denying was no longer something they could pretend wasn't there. The air in the house felt different that evening, thicker, heavier. The usual hum of daily life, the soft sound of children's laughter and routine chores, was absent. Brianna, Zach's wife, was away on a work trip, leaving the house eerily quiet. For Aaliyah, it was an unfamiliar stillness that somehow magnified every sound and feeling. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder, almost echoing in the empty space. It was a kind of silence that felt full of potential, full of the unspoken things they both had been avoiding for so long. Aaliyah, caught in the rhythm of her own thoughts, didn't notice Zach until he was already in the living room. She was folding laundry, her hands moving on autopilot as her mind drifted back to the conversation they'd had the night before the confession, the pull between them that was undeniable. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel the weight of his gaze on her. It was like his eyes had burned into her soul, awakening something in her that she was trying so desperately to suppress. The moment she had feared was now here, and there was no turning back. When Zach spoke, it wasn't the teasing, light-hearted tone she was used to. There was something deeper, something serious in his voice. "Do you ever stop working?" he asked with a teasing smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. His words seemed to slice through the quiet like a knife, leaving a lingering tension in the air. Aaliyah smiled weakly, trying to lighten the mood. "Someone has to keep this place running," she replied, folding another shirt mechanically, her fingers fumbling slightly as her heart began to race. But even as she spoke, she felt the shift in the atmosphere. His presence had filled the room, and this time, it wasn't just the usual casual comfort. It was something else, something charged, something that had been building for weeks, maybe even months. Zach crossed the room slowly, his steps deliberate, and sat down beside her. His closeness made Aaliyah's breath catch in her throat, the sudden proximity igniting a flare of heat deep in her chest. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the faint scent of his cologne, something that had once been comforting, now felt dangerous, like it belonged to a man who was no longer just a father figure, but something more. He looked at her then, his expression serious, almost earnest. "You're more than just a nanny, Aaliyah. You've done more for this family than anyone realizes," he said, his voice low and filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. There was sincerity in his tone, a truth that felt like it had been building up for far too long. Aaliyah's heart pounded in her chest as the words hit her. It wasn't the first time he had complimented her, but tonight it felt different. He wasn't just acknowledging the work she did for the family, he was acknowledging her as a person, as someone who mattered. His words made her feel seen in a way she hadn't realized she needed, and with that recognition came an uncomfortable clarity. "This is dangerous," she thought. "We can't keep doing this." She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes for a moment, as she tried to steady herself. The guilt was still there, lingering, whispering that this was wrong, that she had no right to feel this way. But the desire, the undeniable pull she had been resisting for so long, was louder now. It was no longer a whisper in the back of her mind, it was a roar that drowned out everything else. And then, without warning, Zach reached for her hand. His touch was gentle at first, almost tentative, as though he were testing the waters, unsure if she would pull away. But Aaliyah didn't pull away. Instead, she let herself feel the warmth of his hand wrapping around hers, the electricity that surged through her skin at the contact. His fingers intertwined with hers, and Aaliyah felt a jolt of sensation shoot up her arm. It was like the first spark of a fire that had been building for so long, and now it was igniting with a force she couldn't control. Every inch of her body seemed to come alive, to respond to him in a way that terrified her. This was the moment where everything could change, where the line she had been walking so carefully on would finally break. But she didn't pull away. She let herself feel his touch, let herself acknowledge the heat between them that had been smoldering beneath the surface. And then Zach spoke again, his voice trembling slightly, as though the weight of his own words was finally catching up with him. "I love you, Aaliyah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't imagine my life without you." The words hung in the air between them, a fragile truth that neither of them could ignore anymore. The weight of his confession settled over her like a blanket, suffocating in its intensity. Her breath hitched, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the chaos that had just been unleashed. "He loves me," she thought, unable to fully comprehend what that meant. But how? How could he love me when he has a family? How could I let myself believe it? For a long moment, Aaliyah couldn't speak. She simply sat there, her hand still in his, the world spinning around them. In that moment, it was as though everything had paused, as though nothing else mattered except the truth that Zach had just spoken. The tension between them had reached its peak, and there was no way to go back. Her mind screamed at her to pull away, to run, to stop this before it went any further. She knew it was wrong, knew that she was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But her heart, her body, they told a different story. Her heart raced in a way it never had before, thundering in her chest as if it were begging her to stay, begging her to accept what was being offered. "I love you too," she whispered, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. It was as if she had no control over what was happening anymore. The confession was as much for herself as it was for him, a release of the emotions that had been building up for so long. She could see the relief in his eyes when she spoke, a flicker of hope, of something that had been buried deep inside him for so long. It was as though his own feelings had been waiting for this moment, for her to say the words that would make everything finally feel right. And in that moment, Aaliyah knew with terrifying clarity there was no going back. They had crossed a line that couldn't be erased, and now they would have to face the consequences of their actions. Whatever path they chose now, there was no way to unring the bell they had just tolled. She looked at him, her heart still racing, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel what she had been denying for so long. The desire, the longing, the need that had been bubbling under the surface, it was all real. And now, it was out in the open. But with that revelation came a sharp pang of guilt. "What have I done?" she thought, her heart heavy with the weight of her own choices. She knew what she had to do, but in that moment, in that room, all she could do was sit there, her hands still in his, and wonder what their future would look like now that everything had changed. The affair between Aaliyah and Zach had deepened beyond their control. What had started as a few stolen glances, brief moments of touch, and hushed words in the dark had now blossomed into something undeniable, something far more consuming than either of them could have imagined. The connection between them felt like a magnetic force pulling them closer, even as it tore them apart from the world they knew. Every stolen moment spent with Zach felt like an escape, an oasis in the middle of an emotional desert. When they were together, everything else seemed to disappear. The weight of the world, the responsibility, the guilt, none of it mattered. In his arms, Aaliyah felt cherished, desired in a way she had never experienced before. She had tried to convince herself that it was just a temporary lapse, a mistake that would pass. But as the days turned into weeks, and then into months, she began to realize that the affair was no longer just a fleeting moment of weakness. It had become an addiction, a drug she couldn't quit, no matter how much she tried to fight it. But with every secret rendezvous, with every kiss shared in the dark corners of the house, the guilt grew heavier. It pressed down on her chest like an invisible weight, making it harder to breathe. Aaliyah had always prided herself on her integrity, on her commitment to her faith and her values. But now, every glance she shared with Zach, every touch that lingered too long, felt like a betrayal of everything she had believed in. She could no longer look Brianna in the eye without feeling a sickening twist in her stomach. Brianna, so sweet, so trusting, had always been kind to her. She praised Aaliyah for all the work she did, for the love she poured into caring for their children. "You're practically part of the family," Brianna would say with a warm smile, and each time, the words cut deeper. How could Aaliyah stand there, hearing those words, knowing what she was doing? Brianna saw her as a sister, as someone she could trust implicitly. She never suspected the truth, never knew that her husband had found his way into Aaliyah's heart, and that she, too, had been pulled into a web of lies and betrayal. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Every time she heard Brianna's innocent praise, it felt like a knife twisting in her gut, and yet, she didn't know how to pull away from Zach. The two forces, love and guilt, pulled her in opposite directions, and she was caught in the middle, torn between the two. Aaliyah spent hours lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her choices crushing her. Every small moment with Zach felt like a fleeting treasure, but it came at a price she couldn't afford to pay. Each time they kissed, each time they shared a whispered secret, she felt the wall of lies growing taller, brick by brick. She could no longer pretend that nothing was happening, that she wasn't part of the destruction of a family. She could no longer ignore the fact that with every passing day, she was becoming someone she didn't recognize. She had tried to justify it at first, telling herself that Zach's feelings for her were genuine, that they had both fallen into the situation by accident. But the truth was undeniable now. The affair wasn't just about love, it was about escape. It was about the need for something more than what either of them had. And now, as it spiraled further out of control, Aaliyah couldn't help but wonder if the cost of what they were doing was too great to bear. The guilt gnawed at her constantly. Every time she looked into Zach's eyes, she saw not only the love and longing that he felt for her but also the shadows of their shared secret. And each time Brianna smiled at her, each time the children ran to her with laughter and affection, Aaliyah was reminded of the weight of the lie she was living. It wasn't just a matter of betraying Brianna, it was a matter of betraying herself, her faith, and her own sense of self-worth. One evening, after another of their secret encounters, Aaliyah sat alone on the porch, staring into the darkened night. The cool air did little to soothe her thoughts, which were racing at full speed. She could feel the tension in her chest, the anxiety that had been building for weeks. She needed to talk to someone, needed to confess the truth, but who could she talk to? How could she explain what was happening to anyone without sounding like a villain, without destroying everything? Just then, Zach stepped outside, his presence like a storm on the horizon. He walked over to where she sat, and without a word, sat beside her. His hand brushed hers, and the touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, but she didn't pull away. They sat in silence for a long while, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. Aaliyah's heart pounded in her chest as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She knew that they couldn't keep living like this. They couldn't keep sneaking around in the shadows, pretending that everything was fine. Sooner or later, the truth would come out, and the consequences would be devastating. Finally, she broke the silence. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. It was as though the words had been building inside her for weeks, and now that they were out, she could finally breathe. Zach squeezed her hand gently, his touch reassuring, but there was an underlying desperation in his eyes. "I know," he said softly, his voice full of pain. "But I can't lose you." Aaliyah looked at him, searching his face for the truth of what he was saying. Could he really mean it? Could he truly want to leave everything behind for her, even if it meant breaking apart his family? In that moment, something shifted within Aaliyah. She had always known that there was a breaking point coming, that moment when everything would have to be faced, when the consequences of their actions would no longer be avoidable. But now, sitting here with Zach, she realized that the choice wasn't just his to make. It was hers, too. And for the first time, she understood the magnitude of what was at stake. Something had to give. She couldn't keep living this double life. She couldn't keep hiding behind her feelings, pretending that everything was okay when it was falling apart inside her. But the truth was, she didn't know what would happen if they stopped. What if this was the only thing that had made her feel alive in years? What if walking away meant losing the only connection that had ever made her feel truly seen and loved? Aaliyah's mind swirled with uncertainty, her chest tight with fear. The guilt still consumed her, but so did the desire, the need to be with Zach, to not let him go. But as she sat there, looking out into the night, she knew that no matter what happened next, the consequences of this affair would echo through the rest of her life. The walls were closing in on her, and there was no escaping the truth. Something would have to give, and soon. The affair had spiraled out of control, a whirlwind of emotions and choices that had long since left Aaliyah questioning her own sense of self. What began as a mere brush of hands, a stolen glance, had evolved into something far more dangerous. Each secret rendezvous, every stolen kiss, had pushed her further down a path she never intended to take. With Zach, Aaliyah had lost herself in a way she never imagined possible. The intensity of their connection was undeniable, passionate, electric, but it came with a price. A price she had begun to feel in the pit of her stomach with every passing day. What once had been an illicit escape from her reality had become an all-consuming obsession. The lines between right and wrong, between loyalty and betrayal, had blurred beyond recognition. There was no longer any clarity in her life. In her quietest moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, Aaliyah could hear the whispers of doubt in the back of her mind, the growing realization that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. Each touch from Zach felt like an intoxicating bomb, but each one also made her feel as though she were drowning in a sea of guilt and regret. Her days had been filled with the usual routine, caring for the children, managing the household, but every moment felt like a lie. Brianna's cheerful voice echoed in her mind, reminding her of her betrayal. How could she face the woman who trusted her with her children, with her home? Every time Brianna smiled, every time she praised Aaliyah for her dedication, it cut through her like a blade. It was as though she were wearing a mask, playing a role she no longer recognized. The stolen moments with Zach had turned into reckless abandon. It was as though they were no longer just crossing boundaries, they were obliterating them. The affair had become a fever, a wildfire burning out of control. And Aaliyah could feel it consuming her from the inside out. But as intense as the connection between them was, there was a growing sense of wrongness that gnawed at her conscience. In the quiet spaces between their encounters, Aaliyah couldn't escape the truth that was slowly suffocating her. She had tried to justify it to herself, telling herself that Zach needed her, that she was the one who could make him happy, but the reality was becoming clearer with each passing day. She had fallen into a trap of her own making, and no matter how much she tried to deny it, she could no longer ignore the weight of what they were doing. She was at a crossroads. The affair had spiraled so far out of control that she couldn't see a way back. Could she keep living this lie? Could she continue pretending that everything was fine while the world around her slowly crumbled? Or would the consequences of her actions finally catch up with her, forcing her to face the truth of what she had become? One night, the house was quiet. The children had long since fallen asleep, their small bodies curled up in their beds, innocent and unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Aaliyah sat alone on the porch, her face pale and strained from the weight of the decisions she had made. The cool air of the evening did nothing to soothe the heat that radiated from her body. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, spinning faster than she could keep up with. She felt as though she were suffocating, caught in a web of her own making, unable to escape. It was then that Zach appeared. His footsteps on the porch were quiet, but Aaliyah heard them as clearly as though they were thunderclaps in her ears. She didn't turn to look at him immediately. She couldn't. She was afraid of what she would see in his eyes, the desperation, the need that had only grown stronger with each passing day. "Aaliyah," Zach's voice was soft but urgent, breaking the silence between them. "We need to talk." His words felt like a spark in a dry forest. They both knew that the time had come. There was no more running from the truth. They could no longer pretend that this was something that could be ignored, swept under the rug. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with unsaid words and unspoken fears. Aaliyah closed her eyes, her throat tight with the weight of what was to come. She had known this moment was inevitable, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to face it. She could feel the tears threatening to fall, but she swallowed them down, unwilling to let him see her weakness. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. The words felt like they were ripping out of her, each syllable a piece of her soul. "I've lost myself in this, in you." Her confession hung in the air, a heavy truth that seemed to swallow the space between them. She had said the words, but even as they left her lips, a part of her wanted to take them back. Could she really walk away from him? Could she leave behind everything they had built in the shadows? The answer, however, was clear. She couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep betraying herself, her values, and the people who trusted her. It wasn't just the affair that was tearing her apart, it was the person she was becoming. She didn't recognize herself anymore. Zach's face softened, his gaze filling with a deep, raw emotion. His eyes so full of love, so full of longing, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her chest ache. He didn't speak right away, but when he finally did, his voice was hoarse, filled with the weight of his own pain. "I love you, Aaliyah," he said, his words a desperate plea, a raw confession that he could no longer keep hidden. His hands reached out to her, his fingers trembling as they brushed against hers. "Please don't leave me." Aaliyah could feel the pull of his words, the magnetic force of his love, but she also felt the suffocating pressure of her guilt. His words pierced her, but they were also the final straw that broke her heart. She had to let him go. She had to let this all go. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "but this is destroying me." Her words were the final release, the moment when everything came crashing down. The walls she had carefully built around her heart, the lies she had been telling herself, the emotions she had buried deep inside, everything came rushing to the surface. In that moment, Aaliyah knew that there was no going back. She had to make a choice, one that would change the course of her life forever. Could she keep living in the shadows, bound by guilt and secrecy? Or would she walk away from Zach, from the love she had found in his arms, and try to rebuild the pieces of her life? The decision felt impossible. She loved him. She had never loved anyone like this before. But she couldn't continue to live in the chaos of this affair. It was time to face the consequences, no matter how painful they would be. As Zach stared at her, waiting for her to make a decision, Aaliyah's heart shattered. She had made her choice, but it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. The days that followed the emotional storm between Aaliyah and Zach were a blur of turmoil. Every morning she woke with a heavy heart, the weight of her choices pressing down on her chest. The home she had once considered a sanctuary, a place of peace and routine, had now become a suffocating prison. The walls that had once felt warm and inviting now felt cold, impenetrable, reminding her of the lies, the betrayal, and the guilt she couldn't escape. Each moment spent there felt like a reminder of what she had lost, what she had sacrificed. Aaliyah knew she couldn't stay any longer. The emotional burden had become too much to bear. The love she had once shared with Zach, the dangerous and reckless passion that had driven their affair, now felt like an unbearable weight. The lies, The secrecy, the betrayal, it was all too much. She needed to leave. She needed to find a way out. In the quiet moments of the night, when everyone else was asleep, Aaliyah would slip out of bed and sit in the living room, staring at the empty space in front of her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't continue living a lie. The guilt gnawed at her, the constant reminder that she had broken her own heart and betrayed the trust of the woman who had treated her like family. I can't live like this, she thought, her mind consumed with the overwhelming sense of wrongness. She had to make a clean break. She had to reclaim the pieces of herself she had lost in the chaos of this affair. So, in secret, Aaliyah began searching for another job. She needed a fresh start, a new beginning, far away from the tangled mess of emotions that had trapped her in this house. She scoured job boards late at night, sending out resumes to potential employers, hoping that someone would give her a chance to start over. The thought of leaving Zach, of leaving the family she had grown so attached to, was heartbreaking. But she knew it was the only way. There was no other choice. Packing her bags felt surreal. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being able to handle anything that came her way. But now, as she folded her clothes and placed them carefully in her suitcase, she felt fragile. The tears that had threatened to fall for so long now spilled freely down her cheeks. She didn't want to leave, but she had no other option. This was the end. The end of everything she had known, and the beginning of an uncertain future. The day she handed in her resignation, the air in the house felt thick with tension. Brianna had been busy all morning, preparing for a business trip, but when Aaliyah asked to speak with her, she could sense that something was wrong. Brianna looked up from her papers, her eyes meeting Aaliyah's with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Aaliyah, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Aaliyah felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at Brianna. The woman had trusted her, treated her like family. And now, she was walking away. Walking away from everything. "I've been offered another position," Aaliyah said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of her decision. "I think it's time for me to move on." Brianna's face fell, the shock and confusion clear in her eyes. She had never expected this. They had shared so much together, the laughter, the struggles, the small moments that had made their bond feel unbreakable. And now, Aaliyah was leaving. "I thought we were family," Brianna whispered, almost as though she were speaking to herself. Aaliyah's heart shattered at the words, but she didn't say anything more. She couldn't. She couldn't bear to explain the truth behind her decision, not to Brianna, not to anyone. Instead, she simply nodded, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. Zach, too, had heard the conversation. He had been standing in the hallway, his figure looming in the doorway. Aaliyah's heart clenched when she saw him. His face was a mixture of sadness and resignation, his eyes dark with unspoken emotions. He didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded, as though he had known this moment would come. As though he had been preparing for it all along. "I can't change your mind, can I?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Aaliyah's throat tightened, her heart breaking all over again. She wanted to tell him that she would stay, that they could figure it all out together. But the words wouldn't come. She had made her decision, and no matter how much it hurt, she couldn't turn back. She shook her head slowly, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I have to do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Zach didn't move. He didn't try to stop her, didn't beg her to stay. He simply stood there, his eyes fixed on her, filled with a sadness that seemed to cut through him. Aaliyah could see the pain in his expression, the same pain that was eating away at her from the inside. "I'll never forget you," Zach said quietly, his words carrying the weight of everything they had shared. Aaliyah closed her eyes, her tears spilling freely now. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to explain that this wasn't just about leaving him, but about finding herself again. "I'll never forget you either," she whispered, her voice breaking. And then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. But as she packed her bags and prepared to leave, Aaliyah felt a strange sense of relief. The decision had been made. The choice was final. There was no turning back. The future was unknown, and the road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear: Aaliyah had to move on. She had to find a way to heal. As she left the home that had been her world for so long, she carried with her the weight of the choices she had made, the mistakes, the pain, the love, and the loss. But she also carried with her a glimmer of hope. Hope that, one day, she would find peace. Aaliyah's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the key in the lock and stepped out into the crisp air, leaving the house behind. The home that had once been a sanctuary, a place where she had poured her heart and soul into her work, her life, and the family she had grown so close to, now felt like a distant memory. As the door clicked shut behind her for the final time, she was left standing on the front steps alone. She had spent countless days imagining this moment. In her mind, she had expected to feel relief, to feel a sense of closure. And in a way, she did. But it was coupled with a strange emptiness, a quiet space where once there had been chaos, passion, and confusion. She couldn't ignore the lingering emotions, the weight of her decisions. The lies, the deceit, the moments of intense passion, they were now just fragments of her past. But beneath it all, there was a new feeling. One that had begun to take root in her heart during the long nights when she sat by herself, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. It was a feeling of freedom. As Aaliyah walked away from the house, each step felt lighter than the last. The burden of the affair, the guilt of what she had done, the shame she had carried for so long, were all slowly starting to melt away. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the city as she made her way toward the small apartment she had rented across town. It wasn't much, just a modest one-bedroom unit with bare walls and a simple layout, but it was hers. It was a new beginning. For the first time in months, Aaliyah allowed herself to feel something she had forgotten: hope. When she entered the apartment, the silence was deafening. No children's laughter. No footsteps echoing through the halls. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft sound of her breath. She set her bags down by the door and surveyed her new home. The apartment was bare, but it was hers. She could fill it with new memories, with new dreams. It wasn't perfect, but it was a place where she could begin to heal. Aaliyah's gaze landed on the small prayer mat that she had placed in the corner of the room. She had set it up before she moved in, knowing that it would be a reminder of her faith, her grounding in the world. For so long, she had felt lost, disconnected from everything she had once held dear. But now, as she stepped onto the mat, she felt something shift inside her. She knelt down, her forehead touching the cool floor beneath her as she whispered the words of her prayer. The act was simple, yet profound. It was a moment of surrender, a moment where she acknowledged her mistakes, her weaknesses, and her longing for forgiveness. "I'm ready to begin again," Aaliyah whispered to herself, her voice trembling with emotion. It was a simple prayer, but it carried with it all the weight of the past few months: the betrayal, the heartache, the lies, the guilt. It was also a prayer for strength, for the courage to move forward. As her hands rested on the floor, she allowed herself to feel the peace of the moment. The worries, the fears, the regrets, they slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of clarity. She wasn't perfect. She had made mistakes, serious ones, but she was willing to face them. She was willing to take responsibility for what had happened. She was willing to grow from this experience, to learn, to find herself again. Aaliyah stood up from the mat and looked around her apartment, a sense of determination settling in her chest. It wasn't going to be easy. Rebuilding her life, rediscovering who she was after all the turmoil and heartbreak, would take time. She knew there would be days when the guilt would try to creep back in, days when she would doubt herself and question her decisions. But for the first time in a long while, she felt empowered. She felt as though she had control over her future. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that family's home months ago, full of hope and trust. She was stronger, wiser, and more aware of the complexities of life. She had made a mistake, a huge mistake, but she was determined not to let it define her. The sun had set by the time she sat down on her couch, the soft glow of the city lights outside casting shadows across the room. The apartment was still bare, but it didn't matter. It felt like home now. Aaliyah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. There was still a long road ahead of her, but for the first time in a while, she felt at peace with where she was. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future held. But she was ready to embrace it, to rebuild her life, and to live it on her own terms. If you found this story gripping and want to hear more jaw-dropping tales like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Share your own wild stories or ideas for the next video below. I'd love to hear them.